Hello and welcome to OAG's latest webinar. My name is Deirdre Fulton, partner at Midas Aviation, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. This is the 15th webinar that OAG has run since late March, where we dissect the latest position on the COVID-19 pandemic. It might feel like a lot more than 15, but that's where we are. Some of you who've joined us before will be familiar with the format of these webinars, where we run through some slides and then pose your questions to our panel. And as ever, I'm joined today by John Grant, OEG's senior analyst, who by now must have spent at least 6 months of your life, John, engaged in tracking the impacts of COVID-19.
It feels like it, Deirdre. Good morning, everyone. Time for a holiday, I hope.
Well, hopefully. We're also joined by our regular OEG expert, Mark Clarkson, OEG's EVP of Product Management today. Hello, Mark.
Hey, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone.
And we're also delighted to be joined by Kentaro Yamaguchi, Head of Route Development and Marketing at Japan's Nagoya Airport today. Kentaro-san, thank you for taking time to join us, and we really look forward to hearing from you today.
Yes, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone from Japan. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm trying to my best to give you some idea and some information to you.
Perfect, thank you. We'll look forward to that. Okay, so as usual, we're going to take OEG's data and take a look at really what's happening in terms of air capacity and frequency at global, regional, country level. And then it might not be a surprise that we're going to take a deeper look at Japan today in terms of what's happening in the country in aviation terms and beyond. And Kentaro-san has some interesting insights from us about traveller confidence and what's actually happening on the ground. As usual, we hope to be able to have some time at the end for your questions. So I can see we have a question already, which is a great start. So please don't hesitate to post your questions in the chat box as we go. You'll also get a recording of the webinar later today, so please don't worry about missing anything. And OEG has also launched a traveller sentiment survey this week, and there should be a link to that in the chat box at some point. So please take a moment to complete that if you can. Okay, let's jump in. So, John, here we are again. Globally, number of scheduled flights is down by 55% compared to the same week last year. Now, we've had a bit of debate here about should we have changed the scale here, and should the green actually have started to cut in with positivity being zero. But we're sticking with what we have for now. But you can see actually, can't you, that the red is starting to mold somewhat into pinker shades, and maybe one day we'll be seeing some green countries on this. I think the positive, John, is we've broken through that minus 60% below last year level, haven't we?
We have, and I think although it's become very easy to look at the negative side of the last 6 months, actually in the last 2 weeks there have been some really positive signs in terms of capacity. Particularly in continental Europe, where markets like Spain have seen capacity increase or almost double in the space of 2 weeks, from 500,000 to over 1 million seats a week. And there are other markets in Europe that have had extremely strong growth in the last 2 weeks as lockdowns have eased and quarantines have been removed, and the barriers are coming down. So there is lots of positivity in terms of capacity. Even in China, we're seeing Beijing capacity come back after their second spike, but it's all about demand, Deirdre. It's easy, relatively easy to put the capacity back in, but the demand has got to follow. And some of the airlines that originally pioneered growth out of COVID-19 in the last couple of months, carriers like Qatar Airways and Wizz Air have actually been cutting capacity back this week. So it's a mixed bag, but I think the general sentiment is there's some optimism and things are beginning to move. American Airlines put 1 million seats back in this week. United Airlines capacity grew by 75%. You know, lots of positivity out there.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we'll see the effect of that in a moment when we look at the regional charts. Still a bit of a bit of revision taking place, isn't there, in terms of what carriers are filing? I think it, you know, we've sort of maybe had an expectation that fluctuation might settle down a little bit, but I think until demand really starts to recover and come back, it's not going to, is it? Carriers, we're still going to have this variation between some carriers having a really optimistic view of what's coming and other carriers being more pessimistic, overlaid, I guess, with the geographic restrictions that still take place.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think to that, part of the great challenge we are going to see now, of course, is this capacity recovery, this demand recovery we're 2 weeks into July. We're into the traditional 6-week Northern Hemisphere holiday type season where business travel completely collapses, particularly in August. So for any network planner, any revenue management expert in an airline trying to work their way through how much capacity they should be adding in, it's really, really difficult. And we know from some statistics we saw last week that the majority of airlines are essentially running a rolling 1 month schedule adjustment program. So this week, second week of July, they'll be looking at second week of August and planning to take capacity out. So the dotted line, you know, and what we see is likely to change, no doubt about it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take a look now then at the regional picture, and I think what you described there about Europe looks a bit less sort of dramatic when you compare versus last week, but when we look back actually to 2 weeks ago, that's a big shift, isn't it? Finally, we're seeing Europe get off the bottom of the chart here.
Yeah, it's moved, and as you say, you know, it's only 3 percentage points from the original base, but I think it's an important sign that capacity is coming back, and we will see more capacity coming back. Some airlines are actually bringing forward their planned relaunch of particular routes and markets as they see demand perhaps a bit stronger than expected. But we still, if we look at the global picture, we're only halfway there, or slightly under halfway there, and there are still pockets where we have significant capacity reductions year on year, places such as Africa, where there is many countries that there still declines week on week in the amount of capacity being offered, and in the Southwest Pacific region, with yesterday's announcement regarding the closure of the border between New South Wales and
we're going to see that come back down again, aren't we?
Yeah, we're going to see the Sydney-Melbourne market and all capacity taken out. So that has a dramatic impact. I think it's one of the largest markets and air services in the world. So, you know, we'll see that ripple through next week.
Yeah. Okay. Let's look now. We to sort of build on this piece about airlines and, you know, how they're reacting. We thought it'd be interesting to take a look out to the end of August, to just try and understand a bit more about, you know, what differences are happening. And there's a really different picture, isn't there? Now some of that's about the market and the type of Cathay Pacific in particular, you know, the type of market that you operate in. But we've got everything from cautious, which would you associate sort of cautious behaviour with one of the biggest low-cost carriers in the world? I'm not sure.
Well, I would, in the context of a $228 million quarterly loss that they announced this morning. It would not look good in the eyes of the shareholders with such a loss to be ramping up capacity too quickly. And of course, by holding back on this capacity increase, there is the benefit that their DOCs are not going to get out of control, and they can, be a bit more pragmatic about the market. I think the staggering ones are places like Singapore Airlines, where we probably have quietly forgotten that essentially the airline continues to operate a skeleton network. And is very unlikely to see that rate of capacity growth in the next 2 weeks. And similarly,
in the absence of a domestic market, I think that's the key, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the closure of or the restricted access to their one of their largest markets in Southwest Pacific in Australia. So it's very difficult to see that capacity coming back. And as we'll discuss later, some of the capacity that we see from All Nippon may look like it's operating, but they appear to have a very high cancellation strategy at this moment in time at short notice. So every airline, as I've said so many times, Deirdre, has a different approach. No two markets, no two airlines will behave in the same way through this COVID event.
Yeah, and that's evident, isn't it? It's really evident. Okay, let's look now at one of our usual slides here with the current disposition of countries week on week. And Vietnam jumps out at the top of the table, one of the few countries in the world where frequency is now less than 10% below last year. And cancellations, we're going to come on to look at that in the next slide, but cancellations are running reasonably low as well in Vietnam, so it's not that there's lots of frequency and then it's been cancelled sort of dynamically. And then obviously China and Japan, two big domestic markets there. There's a question, isn't there, about China obviously has had a challenge in recent weeks with the threat of a second wave and an outbreak in Beijing. And I wonder whether, is this the sort of level that we're going to see? Are we going to get past that? Is Vietnam an outlier in terms of its ability to just punch above a bit?
If we don't, I think for nearly every country on your chart, that becomes a major problem. Because that remaining 22% is essentially the international capacity to and from China. And for markets such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, international services to and from China are a major part of their networks and major parts of their connected models for carriers like Cathay Pacific and Singapore Airlines, and indeed both the two South Korean and Japanese international carriers to the west coast of the US. So it's China in so many ways holds the key to significant breakthroughs for all of the countries on that market, on that table you have there. And interestingly, I was just noting again that, for Singapore and Singapore Airlines, we were talking about Australia and that's impact in terms of their lockdown. But India is another key market for them. And they need to be in a position where they can start adding back capacity. So it's a mixed bag. But if China unlocked access, then this chart would probably move, for most countries, 10 or 15% more positive than you see today, purely by that access.
And that's the unknown, isn't it? We don't yet quite know.
No, it certainly doesn't seem so it's going to happen before September. And I can't see them moving from one flight per airport pair per week to as many as the airlines want to operate. So I can see that being a very phased reintroduction of capacity anyway. So it's likely to rumble all the way through to certainly the end of October and the change of schedules and the IATA winter season. But of course, China is very conscious of its position, and globally wants to protect its own communities, understandably so, but equally knows perhaps how much power it has in the recovery in these other countries.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll watch and wait to see what happens there. I mentioned we would look at cancellations. So we've in the past we've shown you this on a sort of less summarized level. What we're showing here is cancellation rate at country level for each week going back to the beginning of April. And so it's interesting, isn't it? Because we were talking maybe back in webinar 5 or 6 of China having a cancellation rate up at nearly 30%. So we've seen that sort of stabilise and slow right down, haven't we, to some degree of normality, never forgetting that, you know, cancellations averaged at 1% before all of this happened. So Australia is sort of back in that range, isn't it? But in the context of it's only operating 25% of the frequency that operated last year. And then Japan has had a quite a high level of cancellations running. You know, at one point, I think, where did we get to? 33%, so a third of flights being operated. But I think, and we'll come on to this, won't we, that there are probably reasons behind that in terms of very high frequency domestic routes. Gives you the ability to cancel flights, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think certainly one of the learnings and one of the new normals that we will see, Deirdre, is higher cancellation rates in particular markets. You know, there is going to be an oversupply of capacity, particularly in sort of what are the traditional trough and low season periods anyway. And those markets and those airport pairs where we have multiple daily frequencies, and perhaps 3 or 4 airlines operating those routes, and we can all think of those types of markets, we will probably see much higher cancellation rates in the next year and a half, 2 years, as airlines commercially drop services and consolidate at perhaps a couple of hours' notice. It's the new order that we get used to.
Yeah. Okay, and to some extent, I think travellers are understanding of that, aren't they? You know, I think certainly where we are right now, there's still an acceptance of actually the driver is to get from A to B, and if the timing of
philosophical
is slightly different, then so be it.
Yeah, philosophical, pragmatic, can't really be bothered to argue it, whatever. You know, I think ultimately reaching your final destination is what people want to do, and tolerating a 35 or a 45-minute delay is acceptable.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take a look now at some charts. Now there's a lot going on this page, so we wanted to take a look, as we mentioned earlier, a bit of a deeper look at Japan specifically. So what we're showing in these charts is an amalgamation of some data about scheduled flights. So these ones go back to January. That's why they look quite busy, because there's lots, got 6 months of data on them now. So we've got scheduled flights and how they have changed over time. We've then got the cancellation rate in yellow at the bottom, and you can see what we were talking about there in terms of Japan, in terms of it running higher. Then you've got overlaid behind that the number of COVID cases in Japan, and it's not Japan, it's Japan domestic scheduled flights, obviously, but this is country level data behind, and then the red bars are the COVID death rate. So you can see clearly, can't you, the spike in cases in Japan, and then it sort of leveling off, and frequency, you know, flattening and then starting to recover. We thought it would be interesting to do a quick comparison against South Korea. So also not in terms of the same scale, but high volume domestic route and reasonably big domestic market. What's interesting is much lower cancellation rate in South Korea, capacity, I suppose a similar sort of story, isn't it? But actually recovery maybe starting earlier as the sort of incidence of cases slowed much down. I guess a much sort of spikier peak in South Korea, and then clear that cases began to become under control, whereas Japan that took a bit longer. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because if we then overlaid a European country or the US on this, the picture would look really different, wouldn't it? I mean, we haven't, in the interests of time, but that's a whole other topic, isn't it?
It is. Every market has its own data and its own patterns. I think given the geographic proximity of these two markets, it's the thing that strikes me is South Korea, certainly from the outside looking in, appears to be a much more competitive domestic market. It doesn't have anywhere near as many airport pairs or cities with direct air services, but those that are served with amazingly high frequency by a number of airlines. And therefore, in terms of cancellation rates, Deirdre, I think there is greater commercial pressure on those airlines to stay in the market and stay operating than perhaps we have seen in Japan, where there are probably about 4 or 5 domestic carriers, and there is a low-cost carrier or a hybrid low-cost carrier, but the reality is 2 airlines control the domestic market in Japan, whereas in South Korea there's 5 or 6 active carriers who all need to maintain their services just to keep a presence in the market.
Yeah.
So Johnson, can I add some comment from me?
Thanks, Kentaro-san.
Yes, as for the domestic competition market, I'd like to mention the competition with bullet train rail system, because we have so many train systems running throughout Japan, but in terms of the competition, the rail is not the real competitor to the longer route like Chitose, Hokkaido, and Haneda route. And as you mentioned, we have so many flights flying between Haneda and Sapporo. And even if some airlines like ANA cancel one flight, people prefer staying the air travel instead of leaking to the other transportation mode like Shinkansen trains. So I would say that the cancellation for the passenger is not the bad choice, because they have so many alternative flights after 1 hour or 2 hours or even 30 minutes. So that must be the reason why ANA or Japan Airlines can, I would say, easily cancel some flights.
Yeah, there's so much choice, isn't there, that that there'll be another flight along, and I mean it's almost like a train, a rail schedule in terms of frequency, isn't it? Right.
And there are other markets in the world where these sort of high density, classically called golden triangle type sort of routes, the New York down to Washington, and Melbourne, Sydney we've mentioned, historically Barcelona, Madrid, these types of markets, whereas Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Los Angeles, San Francisco, there's probably a cluster of 30 or 40 of those markets with such high daily frequency that for airlines it's easily, very, very easy just to roll over and cancel a couple of flights.
Yeah. And apart from the frequency issue, I think that the perception for air travel in Japan is not so good so far. So no airlines like Japan Airlines and ANA have the opportunity to have the aggressive advertisement to encourage people to travel right now. So what they can do is just to add some capacity and seize the customers' feedback. If they have willing to travel, they can still operate some flights. But in reality, as I mentioned, the positive feedback is not visible right now in Japan.
Mm.
So that must be the reason why they add some flights first and then cut some capacity after that.
Yeah, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that
Yeah.
model in other parts of the world as well, aren't we? Okay, let's take a look at. So we thought it would be interesting just to look. So taking the cancellations data a step down and looking specifically at some of the airports in Japan. So it's really clear when you look at this. So we've got Haneda cancellations here, Chitose, and then Nagoya, and it's really clear, isn't it, that it's that this is really a function of what we saw on the previous slide about so many of the high frequency routes operating to and from Haneda and serving the centre. That's also the cancellation rate potentially is also being affected, Kentaro-san, isn't it, by there being a slight increase in the incidence of cases in Tokyo?
Yeah. Of course, this is one of the reasons, but I think this is simply because the frequency difference between Tokyo Haneda and Nagoya Airport.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is that geographically, the Nagoya locates very center of Japan. And as I mentioned, we have so many rail system running. So if people want to choose other transportation model, they can easily cancel their flight. So in Nagoya, once the ANA or Japan Airlines cancel their flight, they will suddenly lose their customers. So that would be the reason why they have to, I would say, have to keep some frequency even under such a weak demand circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Let's look now at. We thought it might be interesting to just take a look at the difference, and this is specifically for Japan. But we'll in our later webinar today, this afternoon, we're going to look at other parts of the world too. How have different carriers responded in terms of the difference between legacy and low cost? And is, are we seeing low-cost carriers, for example, taking the opportunity to get capacity back into the market earlier, perhaps, than others? And so far, we're not seeing that in Japan, are we really? Not yet. And that's probably more of a feature, isn't it, of the ownership of low-cost carriers in Japan. But certainly in other markets, we're seeing different things.
I think certainly that is a factor, Deirdre, no doubt. But I also think in Japan, low cost carriers have traditionally found it hard to break into the airports and the airline system. The market has been quite traditional and quite conservative, and of course there isn't very much capacity available for low cost airlines in Haneda, for example. So if you want to serve the major Tokyo market, and you want to fly low cost, then you're probably heading out to Narita, which is a difficult sell at this moment in time.
Yeah.
And that just adds another travel complexity in a very, very fragile travel process, where you have to get a train or a bus out to the airport, etc., and it takes you time to get there. And I think it just shows it's just how difficult it has been for low-cost carriers that they haven't been able to take advantage of this. And will they be able to as we come out of COVID-19? I think it will be very difficult for them still.
Remains to be seen, doesn't it? Yeah. And I know, Kentaro-san, you're going to come back to this idea of low-cost carriers in a little while. Okay, let's look now at, so obviously we've talked a lot, haven't we, in these webinars about the importance of domestic markets in recovery. And you know, we just talked earlier on about that the missing element is international, and I think this chart at the bottom really for Japan illustrates that, doesn't it? So you know, we can see over the last 5 years, international growth has really been consistent, growing at just above the global average rate each year, compared to domestic, which is mature market. You know, very little growth. No evidence of that low cost penetration, you know, driving fast growth in Japan. And then when we look at this year, so we can see in the darker lines, we've obviously got domestic, and domestic's now sort of stabilised at this minus 40%, minus 35-40%, but international still in the doldrums, isn't it? Essentially.
And again, you know, why are we focusing on Japan this week? Well, you know, it's easy to forget it's the world's third largest economy. It's extremely powerful. It's also, of course, was supposed to be hosting the Olympics probably in about 3 weeks' time, I think, 4 weeks' time.
Yeah.
And you know, it had some hugely ambitious tourism targets that it may or may not have reached. But again, this shows how dependent we all are for the recovery of international capacity and demand to get back to the numbers we've seen before. And the other really what would have been fascinating event this year, of course, was that Haneda created 37,000 additional slots for new international services, long-haul services from Europe, North America, Australasia, and within the region, to begin to really build Haneda into an international to domestic hub facility. The most interesting piece, Deirdre, for me is when you look at the international capacity slide in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah.
You can see how much Haneda has essentially grown in the last 10 years. I think we were saying is it 11% compound growth per annum.
Yeah.
And Narita is somewhere like 2 or 3%. So there is this huge shift of capacity moving from, and consumer choice moving from Narita to Haneda, particularly in the international market, creating a vacuum at Narita for some backfill strategy from airlines or from the airport, but you don't see much of that happening at the moment. Very interesting. And Nagoya continues to perform relatively well compared to, you know, other airports. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You referenced the 40 million figure, which is seems a very long way off now, doesn't it? I mean, I think there was always a question, wasn't there, about whether the 40 million visitors by 2020 was an achievable target or goal, particularly when you see that growth actually started to slow over the last couple of years. But it's now a very distant dream, isn't it? And even I suppose the interesting question is, will the Olympics happen next year? And to what extent would that actually give Japan a real advantage in terms of helping it to kickstart international travel? And I guess that's a question for you, Kentaro-san, isn't it? You know, not to put you on the spot, but
yeah, of course, 2020 was supposed to be a very good year for Japan, but everything has changed at all. But anyway, so I think that Olympics will be the very good opportunity for tourism, as we have seen the good example, like for example, the Barcelona in Spain or something like that. So we expect that after the Olympic Games, the tourism to Japan will booming again. But before we host the Olympic Games, I think Japanese government have to show the public how they can control the risk of virus, because the number of cases in Japan seems stable right now, except for the Tokyo area. However, the outbreak is not over in other countries, other nations. So what Japanese people concerns most is who brings virus from other areas, which includes from the foreign countries. So in order to achieve the Olympic Games, Japanese government should really reinforce the availability of quarantine procedure in the airport. So according to the news site, they are considering the additional special facilities at Narita, Haneda, and Kaisai Airport. I think that will be implemented in a couple of months, but even after these facilities in operation, total availability is still very low compared to the 2019 level. So other airport like Nagoya, Fukuoka, Chitose will take the same role. I mean, distribute other international flights as a gate to Japan. So once we can succeed in the control all risks, which includes the virus and something like that, and host Olympic Games, we can see the positive growth again. Yeah, I don't know when we can achieve these kind of ambitious 4 million goals, but recovery will happen again. I think
it's really interesting. Sorry, John. This point about testing capacity and needing to have control of who's coming in and maintaining public health is really interesting, because Australia are going through this right now. They've got a second wave at the moment happening in Melbourne, who's gone back into lockdown, but there's also a conversation taking place about reducing international flights and capping passenger numbers. I think New Zealand are having a similar debate. So, there's a sense, isn't there, that actually it might be that capacity for testing could constrain the size of an international market that a country can open up to.
Yeah, it has the potential to be added to the list. For terminal capacity, runway capacity, screening capacity, no doubt about it. But going back to the data, what I find is it's a double-edged opportunity really for Japan, isn't it? And specifically, perhaps more Tokyo. If you talk to any tourism board, any government around the world about tourism recovery, economic recovery, they'd be saying to you now, we need a major event, we need something to kickstart demand, and we can't spend too much money on making that happen. And of course, probably 85% of the investment cost is already sunk into Tokyo in terms of infrastructure development and new stadiums and facilities. So it's a bit of a no-brainer if they can logistically make it happen for it to happen. But at the same time, it's the risk, and it's a classic risk and reward equation, isn't it? The risk of global contamination, influx from new markets, etc. But most people would be dying for an opportunity such as Japan and Tokyo has next summer.
And I guess that there's the other factor, isn't there, if we're not thinking about the Olympics, that you mentioned earlier, John, the importance of China, the importance of Chinese outbound travel for Japan. We can't just this chart here is showing us the top 10 inbound markets by seat capacity to Japan, and China, 7% 5 years ago, 10%, and 5 years from now, who knows? It's going to grow, isn't it? Once that market is able to travel and has the confidence to come back.
Huge economic and tourism impact from China into Japan, both on the commercial side, but also on the tourism side, and the amount of revenue they generate into the tourism sector, which is vital when you're trying to recover from any economic crisis, of course. So it is all about China turning the tap back on. It really is.
And we'll hear in a moment, won't we, from you, Kentaro-san, about you have a comprehensive network from your airport to China. So it'd be good to understand the importance of that market from your perspective. Okay, let's move on to our next slides now, which are some slides from you, Kentaro. You're going to talk us quickly through some of your data, and then we'll take some questions from the audience once we get there.
So let me have a quick reference of our airport. Somebody knows about ours, but majority of you know much about Japan, Nagoya, Japan. And please go to the next slide. So the Nagoya Rock is very center of Japan, between Tokyo area and Osaka area. In terms of the population, we have third largest cities, and Nagoya is well known for its industrial market. For example, Toyota headquarters is very near of Nagoya Airport. Please go to the second one, third one. Yeah, here is a domestic network. In 19 summer schedule, we have almost 90 flights a day, connecting to 90 cities. But currently, we have almost 40 flights a day. That means almost 40 to 50% compared to the last year's level. In capacity, we saw the clear recovery to the 40%, but as I mentioned earlier, demand is still low. For example, the average load factor of current domestic flight is still 35 to 40%. So please go to the next one. Yeah, you can go to, here is the international flight network. As you mentioned earlier, we have so many flights to mainland China. So that means we to rely on the domestic inbound tourism in the last couple of years. Yeah, what the key fact is that how to recover this huge demand. So please go to the next one. Yeah, so recently we have conducted some survey in order to know the travelers' appetite for travel. So yeah, this survey was conducted by us, and the answer was collected from the customers who have connected with us by email or social media such as Facebook or something like that. So that means the people who answered the question is basically who loves travel, who loves air travel. But even though still 52% is reluctant to flying right now. So we asked another question to the next slide, please.
I think it's interesting, actually. I just wanted to acknowledge that. I suppose, and maybe this is because of where we are in Western Europe right now. That's lower than it would be if you did that survey here. I think I was slightly encouraged to some extent to see that that it's only 50%. So okay, let's look at the next one.
Yeah. So we wanted to know why people are still reluctant to travel by air. So the result was so shocking to us because, as you can see on the slide, so many people are reluctant to sitting the other stranger. So the majority of the people still cares the distance to other passengers. That means it is difficult to solve this question, to solve these concerns. So what we are thinking of right now is on the next page.
I think this social distancing point's a really interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, it is unrealistic to tackle the main problem them who concerns about the distance to other passengers. So what we are going to do is that instead of solve this problem, we will conduct some marketing campaign in order to distract the public and to creating new norms, such as post coronavirus air travel is good and still normal or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this whole we talked a number of weeks ago now about about the distancing point and whether are people concerned about the proximity to other passengers throughout the journey? So in which case, it's to some extent it's easier to manage that in the airport building, isn't it? Although that gives you a headache about space and processing time and things. But on the aircraft, we've seen airlines, some airlines come out and say that they're not going to sell the middle seat, which I think for me is very much about just trying to rebuild confidence. It's not, if you try and unpick the science behind that, I don't think there really is any science behind it. So I think to how do you tackle the challenge for the industry is going to be how do you tackle those kinds of concerns in an environment where you still might have to get on the plane and sit next to somebody.
At the first phase, as the airline or airport do, we should notify the customers how the clean and how the safe air travel is. But after that, if we do too much, some people may aware more. So that's the point I'd like to mention about.
But we create some, even within one particular airline, you see some very strange mixed messaging. So there is a particular US who has actively joined the marketing trail of saying we will not sell the middle seat and we'll leave it empty, and then comes out last week and says, whilst it's also again promoting it, we'll leave the middle seat empty, that the cabin air is 7 times cleaner than the local grocery shop. So it becomes a very mixed message from the same airline trying to get across that whole confidence issue and rebuilding confidence. And to a point Christian's made on the webinar, it's not just about the aircraft and the airport, it's the whole travel system. So it's as much the hotel as it is the transfer bus or the high-speed shuttle train, and the cleanliness and the processes that are put in place there. And I just think we're not actually messaging effectively to people and providing the reassurance as an industry. And I saw an interesting interview on Friday with Al Baker from Qatar Airways, where he was saying IATA have a set of standards, ICAO have a set of standards, ACI have a set of recommendations, and every government has a set of recommendations and standards. No two are the same.
And that, from a consumer's perspective,
that confusion creates complete uncertainty in the traveller's mind.
And I think it, when you're, I guess there's fatigue, isn't there, at the moment? People are fed up of sort of living under not normal circumstances, in terms of you can't travel to certain places, you can't do the things you would normally do. And to ask people, and so, part of you thinks, well, so then there's greater appetite to escape, get away from it all, go for a holiday, go and be somewhere where you don't have to think about it. But if the process of getting there is so complicated, or not, doesn't feel easy, then that's another barrier, isn't it?
The greatest marketing message at the moment is, or the greatest reinforcement, is actually word of mouth from people who have travelled in the last couple of weeks. And to that point, our Ryanair and others, some of these great low-cost air carriers, if they start selling fares or actually giving them away for £1, which would really upset Lufthansa, Carsten Spohr and Austrian Airlines and the Green Party in the Austrian government, would that actually encourage more travel in the long term, because people would come back and say it was very safe, you know, it was a cleaner environment than it's ever been. I felt reassured in the whole journey.
Although it's a combination of things though, isn't it? So it's not just about it being cleaner. If what what Kentaro-san saw in his survey was that people were concerned about distance to other passengers, then you can't address that really, can you, on the plane? That's the hard bit.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you say that it's unrealistic. You can't address that. So you could have all of the positive experience of it being really clean, and you all of that sort of stuff, but actually you can't address the fact that fundamentally people are concerned about being next to somebody who might pass the virus on to them. And then
absolutely. I mean, there's a comment here from Amanda about, we need governments and chief medical authorities to give us confidence to travel again.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Absolutely bizarre that you can get two chief medical officers standing at two different podiums telling you a different version of what is happening at the same press conference. So we are really, really confused as travellers, and if our leaders can't provide us with that guidance and that confidence, it's not surprising that we have doubt in our minds.
Yeah, I think there's also. Sorry, Kentaro-san, please go on.
Yeah, of course. What we are discussing internally recently is that, of course, majority of people may fear of air travel or the risk of coronavirus itself. But what most important thing is that the Japanese people is, of course, the so conservative people, and we still care of the others, the feedback first, someone's behavior. For example, now I myself want to travel as soon as possible to foreign country, but the neighbor may blame my behavior. So that kind of the social common understanding of the air travel itself is the biggest issue for us.
Yeah, and I think we, in terms of the sort of social dynamics in many countries, actually around the whole sort of quarantine lockdown situation has created almost a bit of a culture of comparison to others that I don't think is particularly healthy. We've seen a lot of that in Europe as well, and I'm guessing in other parts of the world too. I think it's really, it's going to be a really difficult thing for the industry to overcome.
Nobody have experienced this kind of complexity. So we have to discuss with not only with airlines but also the transportation company or travel agency, or like all related companies should be involved to change this situation.
Yeah.
Anyway,
and that's
you've got an appointment in 5 minutes, Deirdre, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, didn't turn my notifications off. Okay. We've got one more slide from you, Kentaro-san, which at least it was just about a webinar, John, and nothing more interesting.
Summer sale isn't on this week, Deirdre. All right. And schools are out, so no parent messages.
Yeah. This is an interesting slide, given what we said earlier about low cost, isn't it?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the penetration rate of Japan is still low. So, but what we are thinking of is, will the laws for LCC change in Japan, and is there any more opportunity for LCC in Japan? So, as we have already known, the AirAsia Japan has their base here in Nagoya, so we have to rely on their recovery. So in order to realize that, we should think of which kind of people may understand the LCC model and which kind of the segment will be leaked to the LCC. So this slide shows you that the LCC compete with intercity night bus and FSC like this. And I think that after the coronavirus crisis, the price will getting more and more higher, even for the intercity night bus and the FSC carriers. So in that sense, the people who are so sensitive to price will notice the advantage of LCC. So if so, we can expand the number of passengers who are the price driven, highlighted in blue. So we expect that LCC role will be more powerful than before. So this is our conclusion right now. What do you think, Johnson?
I think it's very interesting. I mean, the thing that strikes me is why would in the new world, the risk of exposure to an intercity night bus and therefore COVID-19 has escalated, I would suspect, significantly. I mean, there are obviously fewer people on the coach, but you are in that environment for a lengthy period of time, and people fall asleep and they cough and splutter and all of these sort of things. So I think there's a huge opportunity.
Yes.
The great challenge for LCCs, I still maintain, in Japan is a bit like in Europe. Do they have to serve those secondary airports, or can they get sufficient access to the major airports, and specifically Haneda, to challenge the existing status quo? Those 37,000 slots that were identified for use this year in Haneda because of the change in airspace requirements and gaining some space back from the American authorities. It would have been interesting if maybe 1/3 of those were allocated to low cost or new airlines operating domestic services from Haneda, because that would have challenged the status quo. And for anyone who's, and I know Kentaro-san, you're very much aware of Narita. It is a difficult airport to get to for an international or an overseas traveller. And Haneda is relatively simple. You can at least see it from most of Tokyo City, although getting there is a bit harder. And I think you're absolutely right. It is whether this is a breakthrough moment for the low-cost airlines in Japan and strategically around the world. There's never been a better opportunity, I think, for someone who wants to start an airline, because you've got no debt. There's plenty of resources, aircraft, people, slots available in most markets, fuel's at its lowest price, etc., etc. And if you can create a what's perceived as a different type of product with different service levels, it could be fascinating. And I think, we've done consultancy work in Japan, as you know, in OAG, and it's fascinating that there is so much opportunity, and ironically, and that's why we did this webinar. I think there is a great hope for a recovery in the Japanese market, and it may be quicker than people expect.
Yeah.
You're the closest country to the biggest market in the world, or one of the two biggest markets in the world, that is currently on lockdown.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we could go on, couldn't we? I am conscious that we're nearly out of time. We've answered some of the questions as we've gone, but there's one question that I think, Mark, I'm conscious we haven't had much opportunity to come to you this morning at all. But we've had a question about the possibility of looking at some indicators of demand. So it would be great if you could just share some thoughts with us on that, about how we could incorporate that into our future sessions.
Yeah, I think that's for us to take away and work out how we're going to bring that data in. But as some of you might be aware, we have use some of our aggregated passenger booking data in some of the webinars to date, and certainly the OAG customer webinars on Thursdays. But I think it's the overall point as we see the needle moving with capacity and frequency, and airlines continually making changes to the schedules. We are aware, and we do understand that the demand is significantly lower than even the capacity that's in the market. So it's perhaps something that we can take away and look to build into the future webinars. But I think it was Vikram that asked the question. If you want to drop us a note, we can have a little chat about how we can help with some of that data and maybe give you a view on the underlying demand as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. Now, any final thoughts from any of our other panelists? John, Kentaro, San, any parting thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Can't wait to get back to Japan. I think it's going to be a really exciting 2 or 3 years in the world of aviation and airports. Fascinating time.
Great. Maybe next time you'll make it onto the bullet train, John.
Maybe I will. Maybe I'll stand on the right platform, because you'll tell me what the right platform is, Deirdre.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and for your insightful and interesting comments about what's happening in your market. And thank you again for all the questions that have come in throughout. If we haven't managed to get back to you during the session today, we will try and come back to you in the next couple of days. Everybody will get a copy of the webinar, which includes the slides and the audio. And as we said earlier, remember there's a short survey that we put in the chat box, which will also be available on OAG's website about traveller sentiment, and I suppose will help us to understand maybe more around some of the issues that you found in your survey, Kentaro, San, about how travellers are really feeling about travel, and hopefully at some point we'll be able to bring the results back to this audience with some more insights. Okay, so if you are interested in any of the data that you've seen on the webinar today, there are some regular tracking tables and charts that are available on OAG's coronavirus page on the website, so please take a look there, and you can sign up for regular updates so that when there's a new blog or some new data, you'll get a notification about that. I think we'll wrap it up now and leave it there, and hopefully see you on the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.